A few weeks ago, we talked a big game about Revision Zero, acknowledging its weakness while calling for hope. Now, what was once an interesting, but honestly, an underwhelming weapon, recently got buffed in multiple ways. And those buffs went live in 7.0.5, which had us sprinting to check things out immediately. We've already did our side-by-side comparisons, pre versus post, but today, we're gonna do an extensive breakdown of Revision Zero and where it sits now. Now, keep in mind, if you do not have this weapon, unfortunately, FOMO is pretty real. And unfortunately, you're not going to actually get access to this weapon until Season 22 when the exotic mission rotator is added into the game. But if you do, it may be time to give this bad baby a go. Now, Revision Zero is very unique. It's essentially 3 guns in one. It has a 4-round burst mode, which is its light burst variant, and a 2-round burst mode, which is its heavy burst variant, as well as a sniper rifle mode, which fires off some hefty sniper shots. Now, it's the first exotic with multiple catalysts. It has the crafting flexibility of a legendary weapon, as well as intrinsic anti-barrier capabilities. Honestly, guys, the last time we had a weapon with this many ways to play with it was Kvastov back in D1. It was like the Swiss Army knife of Destiny, and that's essentially what is happening here with Revision Zero. But being a Swiss Army pulse also meant that previously Revision Zero didn't really excel in any particular role. Now, our last breakdown of Revision Zero and its previous damage numbers explained why. The 4-shot light burst crit damage at Carl was 3,422 on minors for a max DPS of 26,665, and on majors, hence Carl here, it was 1,728 per crit with a max DPS of 12,960. And that's not bad for a pulse rifle, but the 2-shot heavy burst tells a different story. Minor crits were 4,773 damage for a max DPS of 23,865. And on majors, that was 2,411 per crit for a DPS of 12,055. The heavy burst did less damage than the light burst. And because it takes the same number of crits to charge up a sniper shot, regardless of which burst you choose, the heavy burst suddenly feels pointless. Less damage and maybe an extra meter or 2 of range. And it takes twice as long to charge the alt fire. So what's the point? It turns out Bungie actually agreed here, and they announced a few changes that are now live in the game. First, the heavy burst received a massive 75% damage increase. Second, the sniper mode called Hunter's Trace received a 25% damage increase. And third, the sniper interaction with 4 times the charm, being its catalyst, was stabilized to not interact with its own effects on the pulse rifle modes. Now, if that's confusing, hang tight. We're gonna break that down in just a bit. And lastly, but not least, pulse rifles got a 20% buff against red and orange bar enemies. These are minor and elite enemies inside of PvE. This also applied to Revision Zero. Now, according to Bungie, these changes were made to make each firing mode of Revision Zero feel distinct and viable. The intended role of the light burst is to quickly charge up Hunter's Trace. And note here, guys, it takes 12 crits to load a single sniper bullet, up to a maximum of 4. And the heavy burst, which fires half as many shots per burst and has half the clip size, simply cannot reach the same number of crits to charge up Hunter's Trace. So of course, its trade-off would mean it needs to do more damage, and so it does. So essentially, the light burst does less damage and the heavy burst does more, which brings us to our current performance. Because again, this is all in theory. We took our revised revision back to Carl to see how they stack. So starting with the 4-shot light burst, things are all pretty much as we expected. Against minors, body shots do 2,421 damage. Crits do 4,106 for a max DPS of 30,795. Again, the DPS went up because of the 20% blanket buff to all pulse rifles. Now, understand against Carl and other majors, the 20% here does not apply. This is only against minors and elites, that being red bars and orange bar enemies. Majors like Carl, bosses, or even mini bosses like champions or tormentors, those damage buffs do not apply. Now, the 2-shot heavy burst again tells a different story. And at Carl, damage dealt to minors is 6,272 per body and 10,023 per crit for a max DPS of 50,115. Again, even though the weapon lists its rate of fire as 450 for the light burst, in our 60 FPS testing with auto fire enabled, the heavy burst shot 6 bullets in 72 frames, which gives us an RPM of exactly 300. I know there's some folks claiming it's 320, but again, based on our testing, we're clocking in at 300 rounds per minute. Anyways, a DPS against minors being 50,000 is pretty incredible. And against majors, that 75% damage buff applies. Again, the 20% damage buff that was a blanket buff did not, but the 75% damage buff applies everywhere. Now, keep in mind the increase isn't as drastic of a difference, but still nice. 2,640 per body and 4,219 per crit, the max DPS of 21,095. I know that's a lot of number soup, but there's something interesting there. The damage increase for the light burst checks out, but those heavy burst numbers felt a bit high. Checking the 7% increases for the damage values reveals why. While Revision Zero deals an additional 75% against Koro himself and his yellow bar pups, against red bars, things are a bit higher than expected. A 75 and 20% increase combined should be 95%, but these damage values are actually 110% over pre-patch damage. What that means, guys, is that this was not a cumulative buff, but instead multiplicative. And the math here checks out. And before someone says cross, why wouldn't it be that? That just seems logical. You'd be surprised, man. Like, I remember back in the day when we used to have buffs and debuffs in the game, and they were really steering things away from being multiplicative. Now, finally, let's talk about the sniper rifle form. Hunter's Trace damage against miners is now 43,192 per body and 130,000 flat per crit. Against majors, that's 18,179 per body and 54,714 per crit. Now, we're seeing the same effect here as with the heavy burst, though not as drastic. Against majors, the 25% damage increase is what we expected, but against miners, it's actually a 50% increase. Again, multiplicative here. Now, regarding the fourth timer refit, 4 times the charm states that rapidly landing 4 precision hits adds 2 rounds to the magazine. Now, this is particularly useful because with Revision Zero, once you fire all 4 shots, you're back into pulse rifle mode. Thanks to this catalyst though, landing 4 crits expands that to 6 at no cost, pulling bullets out of thin air and into your clip. Now, previously, the 4 timer refit could actually persist from one firing mode into the next, and it might actually force you out of the sniper prematurely. Bungie says that 4 times the charm now resets itself when switching firing modes to avoid this issue. In our testing, it seems like it's working as expected. Landing 4 crits does indeed grant 2 more shots at Hunter's Trace that can be fired before returning to your selected pulse rifle mode. But most notably, you should not be able to fire 8 shots with those sniper shots in a row. Now, with all this being said, is Revision Zero actually meta now? Considering we're in Grandmaster season, a lot of people are coming by asking, hey, should I be using Revision Zero? The truth is, right now, this is one of the best anti-barrier tools in the game for dealing with champions. However, there is a lot of competition. Most notably, things like Outbreak Perfected, which it too received that damage buff alongside other pulse rifles. And that includes those Siva nanites, which cranks up our DPS against majors upwards of 30,000. I'm gonna be hard pressed to use Revision Zero over Outbreak. And even though we have hefty DPS in the heavy burst mode now, personally, I find the 2 burst mode of Revision Zero to just not feel good. Like, to me, it just doesn't feel good. Yes, it does a great job at stunning champions. Yes, swapping to that sniper mode and shredding that barrier champ through its barrier feels like anti-barrier sniper rifle. It's phenomenal. But in terms of just clearing ads, I am not a fan of Revision Zero. And I think the emphasis is on the sniper rifle form. Everybody's like, oh, the damage. And don't get me wrong, I love the damage, but the 2-round burst mode to me just doesn't feel good. And a huge reason for that is just the mag size sucks. On top of that, 4 times the charm, I don't think is gonna be the perk I choose. Not for running GMs. And I think 4 times the charm was something we really got hung up on for Revision Zero because we wanted those 6 sniper rifle shots. But now I'm in a situation where it's like, hey, I would prefer just something to help me with my reload speed. And so I'm starting to lead more toward the Feeding Frenzy Catalyst or even Outlaw, especially for the 2-round burst mode. Even though Revision Zero is doing more damage, I can't help but ask for more. Perfection is almost there. I feel like the weapon rewarding targeting data per crit is really nice, and it's similar to something like Hawkmoon, but I also wish that when I actually land a kill, whether it's a crit kill or not, this too loads targeting data. And perhaps if it's a precision kill, it gives you a chunk of targeting data. So I know this is very bold of us to be asking for yet another buff after this weapon got a ton of buffs. But keep in mind, in that same slot, you have some monsters competing against Revision Zero. Wishender, Outbreak Perfected, Arbalest, which I know is a special weapon, but still, for anti-barrier, you've got Arbalest, Striga, Quicksilver Storm, which is doing a hefty amount of damage. And that weapon loads 3 grenade launcher shots in a single magazine. So the buffs handed out to Revision Zero is fantastic. But with that being said, we need more. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching. And as always,
slap that like button like your mama told you right.